The Solvari Palace Station's older residential wing had been built 400 years ago by architects who understood load distribution with the specific intuition of people who worked without computational modeling, and who compensated for the absence of calculation with the accumulated wisdom of generations of building things that had to last. It had lasted. 400 years was evidence of competence that Emre Doal respected in the particular way he respected all structural competence, which was directly and without sentimentality. The wing had lasted because it was well built, and well built meant the load was correctly distributed, and the materials were correctly chosen, and the junction points were designed with sufficient redundancy that 4 centuries of thermal cycling and gravitational variation, and the slow settling of station infrastructure, had not exceeded the tolerance the original architects had built in. 4 centuries, though, was a long time. Even well-built things accumulated stress. The question was never whether accumulated stress would eventually find an expression, but where and when and how severe the expression would be when it arrived. The Engineering Bureau's report had flagged 3 junction points. Emre had assessed all 3 in the first 2 weeks of the 6-week posting, and had found 2 of them manageable with standard reinforcement procedures, and one of them more serious than the report had indicated and requiring immediate intervention, which he had performed with the Palace Facilities team, and which was now stable. He had also, in the course of the assessments, found a 4th junction point that was not in the report. The 4th junction point was in the secondary residential corridor's ceiling section between the 30 and 50-meter marks. It was a connection between the original construction's primary load-bearing element and a secondary reinforcement that had been added approximately 200 years after the original build. Added correctly, by the evidence, by someone who had understood the original architecture well enough to work within it, but added at a point in the station's gravitational history when the load distribution had been slightly different from its current configuration, and the 200 years since the addition had produced a progressive misalignment between the original element's load path and the reinforcement's load path that was, in Emre's assessment, within the tolerance range but approaching its boundary. He had written this in his assessment notes on the 41st day. He had flagged it as urgent review required before standard scheduled reinforcement window. He had not yet formally communicated this to the court's facilities office, because the formal communication required a completed assessment subreport, and the subreport required the thermal variance data from the corridor's monitoring system, which he had requested on the 41st day, and which the facilities office had not yet provided on the 43rd day. And the process was moving through its institutional channels at institutional speed. He was in the corridor on the 43rd day at the 14th hour because he was always in the corridor at the 14th hour, or in some corridor like it, because the assessment required it, and because corridors were where the truth lived. He was at the 60-meter mark, looking at the ceiling section above the 55-meter junction, with the focused attention of someone who had been looking at this corridor for 6 weeks and knew its specific grammar of material and age and stress. He heard the first failure sound at the 30-meter mark ahead of him, which was the sound of the progressive misalignment exceeding its tolerance boundary. A sound he had heard twice before in his career, in different structures, which was twice more than most people heard it, and which he recognized immediately and completely. He also, in the fraction of a second that the recognition occupied, registered the person in the corridor ahead of him. She was at approximately the 45-meter mark, which put her inside the section that was going to come down. She was young. He registered this as a fact about the threat assessment rather than as a fact about her specifically, because the threat assessment was what was relevant in the fraction of a second available. She had turned at the first failure sound, the way people turn at sounds that don't fit the expected ambient register, and she was in the specific suspended state of someone who has registered that something is wrong and has not yet resolved what the wrong thing is into an action. 12 meters, 4 seconds of margin, maybe 5, before the secondary failure propagated to the primary junction. Emre moved. 12 meters is not a long distance. In the conditions of a structural failure, the first failure sound already in the air, the secondary propagation beginning in the material above. The dust starting to release from the junction points as the load path destabilized. 12 meters had a specific character that was different from 12 meters in any other context, which was that every fraction of a second within it was a fraction of a second within a fixed and non-negotiable budget. Emre covered them in the way he moved through structural assessments, which was the way of someone who always knew where their feet were and why. Not the automatic movement of someone running from something, but the directed movement of someone running toward a specific point for a specific reason, which was faster because it did not contain the wasted motion of emergency running, which always contains wasted motion because the person running does not know exactly where they are going. He knew exactly where he was going. 6 weeks of this corridor had given him its geography at a resolution that went beyond the visual. He knew the floor's surface irregularities, the width of the space at each meter mark, the location of every structural element that was relevant to a person's safety in a cascade failure. The alcove at the 40-meter mark was set into the corridor's load-bearing wall. The original wall, the one the architects 400 years ago had built correctly, and it was deep enough to hold 2 people out of the fall zone and was positioned at the exact boundary of the section that was going to come down. He reached her at the 43-meter mark. He did not say anything because there was no time for anything to be said, and because what needed to happen did not require her understanding. It required her movement, and her movement was what he was producing by reaching her, by the specific direction and quality of his approach, which communicated the destination more efficiently than any verbal instruction. She moved with him. This was the thing he noted later in the reconstruction. She moved with him rather than against him or in a different direction, which required either trust or the specific animal response to proximity and direction in an emergency. And he did not know which it was, and it did not matter, because she moved. They were in the alcove at the 40-meter mark, when the ceiling section between the 30 and 50-meter marks came down. The sound of a cascade failure in a 400-year-old structure is not a sound that resolves quickly. It is a sequence of sounds, each one the consequence of the one before, the load redistribution propagating through the material in the specific way of systems exceeding their tolerance, each junction yielding and transferring to the next. It lasted 11 seconds. The dust was significant. The debris field extended from the 30 to the 48-meter marks, which meant the alcove at 40 meters was at the edge of the field, which meant his assessment of the fall zone's boundary had been accurate to within 2 meters. He assessed the damage from the alcove with the attention he had given the corridor every day for 6 weeks, updated now by the specific information the failure had provided, which sections had come down, which had held, what the load redistribution had done to the remaining elements, where the secondary risk zones were in the aftermath. This took approximately 90 seconds, during which he was aware of her beside him in the alcove, in the peripheral way of someone who is doing triage, and who will attend to other things when the triage is complete. At the end of the 90 seconds, when he had sufficient picture of the immediate structural situation, to know that the alcove and its surrounding section were stable, and that the remaining failure risk was in the section behind them rather than ahead, he said, "Are you hurt?" She said no. He said good and returned his attention to the corridor, because the corridor still required attention, and good was the answer that meant the next priority was the corridor rather than her. She was quiet beside him for a moment. Then she said, in Terran standard that was careful and precise in the way of someone who had learned it formally rather than conversationally, "What are you doing?" "I'm assessing the remaining risk," he said, still looking at the corridor. "The section behind us is more unstable than the section ahead. We need to move forward toward the exit at the 60-meter mark when I'm satisfied the forward path is clear." She was quiet again. Then, how did you know the alcove? 6 weeks of structural assessment, he said. This corridor is my primary work area. I know where the safe points are. She absorbed this. How long have you known the ceiling was going to fail? 2 days, he said, and the honest precision of it was not, in the moment, something he applied any social calculation to. He had known for 2 days, and the question was accurate, and the accurate answer was 2 days. The institutional complexity of why the formal communication had not yet been completed was a separate question and a real one, and it was not what she had asked. She did not respond to this immediately. He completed his forward assessment and said, "We can move. Stay close to the right wall and don't look up until we're past the 60-meter mark." They moved. She stayed close to the right wall. The corridor held until they were clear of it, and then the emergency response team was there, and the formal process of aftermath began. The official incident report was filed by the palace's emergency response coordinator at the 17th hour of the 43rd day, which was 3 hours after the failure and 1 hour after the affected section had been formally secured and the structural risk assessed as contained. The report described the failure in the specific neutral language of official incident documentation: structural cascade in secondary residential corridor. Contributing factors under review: 1 court member present at time of failure, successful evacuation, achieved with assistance of Terran Technical Mission Advisory personnel. 1 court member, Terran Technical Mission Advisory personnel. The language of documentation that processes events into categories and categories into manageable records. Emre read the report at the 19th hour, when it was circulated to the Technical Advisory Mission as a matter of formal protocol. He noted the accurate elements and the inaccurate elements, and the elements that were accurate in their facts and incomplete in their picture. And he wrote his own assessment report, which was longer and more specific, and which would be read by the people whose professional function required them to read structural assessment reports, and not by anyone else. His own assessment report included the timeline of the 4th junction point's identification, day 41, and the thermal variance data request, day 41, and the data's non-receipt as of day 43, and the intended formal communication schedule, which had been day 44 or 45 depending on the data's arrival. He wrote this accurately and without editorial framing, because his report was a technical document and technical documents were not the place for editorial framing, and because the timeline was what it was and accuracy was the only appropriate way to record it. The Engineering Bureau's account, which circulated separately through the palace's internal communication channels, was also accurate in its facts. It described the 4th junction point as presenting within normal variance ranges as of the most recent Bureau assessment, which had been conducted 8 months prior, and noted that progressive misalignment of the kind observed could develop within the interval between scheduled assessments, and concluded that the failure was consistent with the known limitations of the assessment interval protocol. All of this was true. None of it engaged with the 41st day or the assessment notes or the thermal variance data request, because the Bureau's account was not written to engage with those things. Emre noted the Bureau's account without surprise. Institutional accounts of institutional failures had a consistent character across species and contexts, which was that they accurately described what had happened without describing the part where the institution had not moved at the speed the situation required. He had seen this before. He added a section to his own technical report that documented the assessment notes and the data request and the intended communication timeline without characterizing the Engineering Bureau's account, because his report was a technical document, and then he submitted it and returned to the structural assessment, which still needed to be completed. Princess Lyra, in the hours following, was in the palace medical wing being assessed by the medical team and attended by her attendants and resting, formally. Her mother, the Queen, received the reports and scheduled a formal review of the corridor assessment protocols. Her two older sisters asked about her, separately and with the specific quality of sibling concern that is genuine, and also managing its expression for an audience. The court moved around the event with the practiced motion of an institution that has processed unexpected events before and knows how to process them back into its operational structure. Lyra rested physically. Her mind was doing something different from resting, which was the thing minds do when they are working through an event that has produced a before and an after with a very clear line between them. She was thinking about 11 seconds and an alcove and a voice that had said, "Are you hurt?" in the specific tone of someone asking, because the answer determined what came next rather than because the asking was the point. She was thinking about the corridor and the assessment and 2 days, which she had not told anyone, and about the fact that the man who had said it with the same quality as everything else he had said, which was the quality of someone to whom the truth was simply the accurate answer rather than a thing with other considerations attached to it. At the end of the 3 days, she was still thinking about this, and she had attended 2 formal court events and a family dinner, and had answered the questions people asked her with the composed responses of someone who has been told to rest and has rested and is fine. And she was fine. And she was also carrying something in the place where the 8 seconds lived that had not been addressed by any of the official accounts or the formal review or the composed responses, and which she had not found a way to put down. On the morning of the 46th day, the formal court session was scheduled, and Emre was on the Technical Advisory Mission's observer list for the session, because the session included infrastructure planning items, and Lyra was informed of the session's agenda and did not specifically note the observer list. The formal court session of the Solvari royal house had a specific spatial grammar that Emre had been briefed on before his first attendance as an observer, which was the session 2 weeks prior to the corridor failure. The observer positions were along the chamber's left wall, behind the formal delegation tables, in the specific zone of the room designed for people whose presence was required, and whose participation was not: the technical advisors, the documentation staff, the junior diplomatic support personnel who attended for the institutional record and who were expected to be, from the room's perspective, furniture that breathed. He was good at being furniture that breathed. 6 weeks of corridor assessments had accustomed him to spending long hours in spaces without being the space's primary concern, which was a useful quality in an observer role, and which he applied without effort. The session had been running for 40 minutes when it reached the point of particular tension. The negotiation concerned the allocation of a contested resource corridor, not the Veth corridor or anything immediately adjacent to his work, but a political matter entirely outside the structural assessment brief, which he was observing because it was on the session's agenda, and because the Technical Advisory Mission's protocol required a representative at all sessions that included infrastructure planning items, and the infrastructure planning items came later in the agenda. He was present for the political negotiation because it preceded the infrastructure items, and he was furniture that breathed, and the political negotiation was escalating toward the specific impasse quality of 2 factions that had arrived at irreconcilable positions and were waiting for the room to resolve what they could not. Queen Sorvana was managing the impasse with the specific quality that Emre had observed in her over 2 sessions, and which the briefing materials had described as exceptional diplomatic authority, and which he experienced more precisely as the quality of someone who had been managing irreconcilable positions for long enough to have developed genuine patience for the process, rather than the performed patience of someone waiting for it to be over. She was listening to the second faction statement with the full attention she gave everything, which was total, and without the division that most listeners allow themselves in extended formal exchanges. The chamber's attention was concentrated on the impasse. The side entrance door opened. Emre registered this peripherally in the way he registered most things, which was completely and without redirecting his primary attention from whatever he had been attending to. The side entrance was used by court members in transit between the residential and formal wings, and people came through it at intervals during sessions without disrupting the formal proceedings, which the chamber's protocol accommodated. He registered the door and the figure coming through it, and in the fraction of the next second he also registered the quality of the movement, not the transit movement of someone passing through on their way somewhere, but the directed movement of someone who has somewhere specific to be in this room, which was a different quality and which produced a different prediction about what would happen next. He had seen this quality of movement before, 43 meters of it, in a corridor, 3 days ago. Princess Lyra crossed the chamber floor with the directness of someone who has been carrying something for 3 days and has decided that the formal occasion is not a sufficient reason to continue carrying it. She did not look at the factions or the diplomatic tables or the political impasse or the Queen's expression. She looked at him, which was how he knew she had registered his position in the room before she entered it, which meant she had looked at the observer list. The chamber noticed her crossing before she reached him. Because a princess crossing a formal court chamber during an active session in the direction of the observer section was not a thing that happened within the court's normal operational categories, and the chamber's attention adjusted accordingly. The two factions, the diplomatic support staff, the documentation personnel, the Queen, all of them recalibrating their attention to track the direction of the movement and its destination. She stopped beside him. She was not performing anything. Her face had the specific quality of a person who is doing a necessary thing and has decided that the necessity outweighs every formal consideration currently in the room, which was not a reckless quality but a determined one, and the distinction mattered. She turned to look at her mother. The Queen was already looking at her, with the expression of a parent who has shifted from political to personal in the fraction of a second that parental attention requires when a child enters a room looking like this. "Mother," Lyra said. Her voice carried in the chamber the way voices carry in high-ceilinged rooms where everyone has gone quiet. "He's here, the human who saved me." The court froze. Emre stood in the frozen quality of the chamber and understood, in the specific retrospective clarity of a moment that has just revealed the structure that was there all along. That the 43rd day and the 46th day were the same day in the way that cause and consequence are the same event. That the 8 seconds in the corridor and this moment in the chamber were connected by the person standing beside him, who had carried the connection for 3 days and had arrived here with it. The Queen's expression moved through something complex and arrived at something clear. She was looking at him with the specific quality of a parent who has just understood something about their child's 3 days that the official incident report had not contained, and that the corridor assessment protocols review had not addressed, and that composed responses at family dinners had not communicated. She was looking at him and he was looking back. Because looking away from a queen looking at you in a formal chamber full of frozen people would have been the wrong quality of thing, and he had always been the kind of person who looked at things directly. He did not perform the moment. He stood in it with the same quality he had stood in the corridor, present, direct, without adding to it something that was not already there. Lyra looked at him then, sideways, with the expression of someone who has done a thing and is standing in its aftermath, and is not apologizing for it. She said, in a lower voice not intended for the chamber, but in a chamber this quiet intended for everyone. "I thought someone should say it." He looked at her for a moment. She had carried the 8 seconds for 3 days and had arrived here with them, and had said the thing that the official incident report had processed into neutral language, and the engineering bureau's account had not addressed, and the composed responses at family dinners had managed around. She had said it in a formal court chamber in front of everyone, because the formal chamber was where it needed to be said, and because she was 17 and certainty at 17 does not always wait for a convenient moment. "Noted," he said, in the same calm voice he had used in the corridor, and meant it, because she was right that someone should have said it, and she had been carrying it alone for 3 days, and the saying of it was accurate, and accuracy was what he valued consistently regardless of the context in which it was delivered. The court's frozen quality lasted another moment, and then began to release, the way frozen things release. Gradually, the political impasse which had been the room's primary concern, reconsidering its primacy against the specific weight of what had just occurred. The factions and the advisors and the documentation staff recalibrating their understanding of the session's morning and what it contained. Queen Sorvana looked at Emre for a long moment before she looked at her daughter. And in the look was something that the briefing materials had not prepared him for, and that the incident report had not captured, and that the 43 days of corridor assessments had not produced, the look of a parent who has understood, across the distance of a formal chamber, what their child's 3 days had been about, and who is looking at the reason for those 3 days with the full attention of someone taking a complete account. She said, in Terran standard that was precise and deliberate, "You will remain after the session." It was not a question. It was not a command in the military register. It was something in between, the specific tone of a significant person who has something they need to understand and has identified the person who can help them understand it and is communicating that directly. "Yes," he said, because it was accurate and because there was nothing else to say. The session resumed. The political impasse was managed, eventually, through the Queen's intervention, which she applied with the same quality of attention she had given everything else in the session's morning. The infrastructure planning items were reached at the session's second hour, and addressed with the competence of a court that knew what it was doing. Emre stood in his observer position through all of it, and was furniture that breathed, which was what the role required, and thought about the corridor and the 8 seconds and the 43rd and 46th days, and about the 17-year-old standing beside him, who had decided that the formal occasion was not a sufficient reason to continue carrying something that needed to be said. He thought she had been correct about that. He thought she had been correct about a lot of things, for someone who had needed to be told to stay close to the right wall and not look up. At the session's conclusion, when the court was receding into its post-session movement, and the factions were managing the aftermath of the impasse's resolution, and the documentation staff was compiling the session's record, Lyra was collected by her attendants and moved toward the residential wing with the specific quality of someone who has done the thing they came to do and is now returning to the regular world. She looked at him once before she went, with the look of someone checking that the thing they did produced the outcome they intended, which it had. He remained. The Queen came to him in the chamber's reduced formality of the post-session, when the room was not empty but was no longer performing itself, and she looked at him with the full attention she had directed at him during the frozen moment, and she said, "Tell me what happened in the corridor." "Not the official account," she said, before he could respond. "The actual account." He told her the actual account. He told her about the 41st day and the thermal variance data request and the subreport process and the 43rd day's arrival and the 8 seconds and the alcove and the specific knowledge of the corridor that 6 weeks of structural assessment had built. He told her with the same quality he had told Lyra how long he had known, directly, accurately, without the institutional framing that the official accounts had applied. She listened to all of it with the complete attention that was her characteristic quality. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone reaching a conclusion that they have been building toward across the account's duration. Then she said, "The formal review of the corridor assessment protocols will be accelerated. The thermal variance data request process will be reviewed as a specific item." He said, "That would be appropriate." She looked at him steadily. "There is a difference," she said, "between a person who does their job correctly and a person who does the job is actually for." He looked back at her. He had stood in this chamber's frozen moment, and in the corridor's 8 seconds and in 43 days of structural assessments, and he understood what she was describing, because it was the distinction he had always applied to his own work without having someone name it back to him. "The corridor is my work area," he said. "What happens in it is my responsibility regardless of the institutional communication timeline." She nodded once, with the quality of a decision being made. "The technical advisory mission's engagement will be extended," she said, "beyond the residential wing assessment." He said, "I'll need the thermal variance data for the remaining sections." "I will see that it is provided," she said, and for the first time in the session's aftermath, something in her expression moved in the direction of something warmer than formal. The specific fractional warmth of a parent who has just had a 3-day question answered and is standing on the answer's other side. He walked out of the formal chamber into the palace station's afternoon, which was going about its business with the consistent indifference of afternoons, and he thought about corridors and load-bearing walls, and the junction points where things connected that were not supposed to fail and sometimes did anyway, and about the 46 days of his posting, and what the 46th day had added to the 43 that preceded it. He thought that the structural assessment of the remaining sections would take approximately 8 more weeks, which was longer than the original brief, and which would require the thermal variance data, and the engineering bureau's cooperation, and the specific patience of someone who understood that load-bearing walls did not reveal their actual condition quickly. He thought he was adequately equipped for all of those requirements. He went back to the corridor, which